I don't know if there's an injunction stopping me telling you who is the BBC presenter, highly paid and central to the BBC's output, according to the scuttlebutt in the newspapers that are dancing around that issue this evening. How would I know if there was an injunction? All I know is that my editor is presently convulsed, having kittens at the possibility I will say who it is. But if what I think is true, it is the gravest crisis yet for the BBC in this kind of thing. Not only because the person involved is, as the newspapers say, central to the BBC's output, but also because of the complete cod that they are making, again, at dealing with sexual allegations against an important BBC figure. You'd think Sir, that's what he was called, Jimmy Savile, had never happened. You'd think they hadn't been down this road 1, 2, 5, 10 times before. Rolf Harris, Jimmy Savile, all kinds of them. I better not misname anybody. So I'll stop at those two, the two biggest cases in the last decade. But they're making all the same mistakes again. And it seems to be a curse on so-called national broadcasters. In fact, merely mouthpieces of the state that pays for them, directly or indirectly. There was already an enormous head of steam behind the campaign to abolish the license fee in Britain. Now I predict this will become unstoppable. So let me add my voice. Defund the BBC and RTE and all the other state mouthpieces around the world. No one should be forced to watch any particular television or pay for it, whether they watch it or not. Even Stalin didn't think of that one, sending pensioners to prison for refusing or being unable to pay the ever more exorbitant license fee. Now that I've got that off my chest, let me turn to far weightier matters. A cluster flux. That's the only way you can describe a situation whereby the United States of America, who said from the podium in the White House 12 months ago, through the mouth of Jen Psaki, the then spokesperson of President Joe Biden, that cluster bombs constituted a war crime, to 12 months later justifying the supply of exactly those weapons to Ukraine from the United States. The commander-in-chief, in his dotage, possibly unguardedly, was very honest about why. Because they're running out of ammunition, he said. Which means, of course, that his friends, Zelensky's friends in the armories of Europe and North America, must also be running out of ammunition. And yet, not a village has been taken in the so-called spring, then summer counter-offensive. So now that you've told the Russians that you've all run out of ammunition, well, you'll be lucky if they stop at Kiev, because there must be a temptation to quiet these yapping dogs in the Baltic states. There might even be a temptation to settle scores with the Polish bigger yapping dog. But I don't think that that will happen. I don't think Russia intends even to go to Kiev. But there is no doubt that Ukraine and NATO have lost the war, not just on the battlefield, but in the production plants, in the military-industrial complex. It turns out that notwithstanding an eye-watering amount of money spent on defense budgets, none of the NATO countries are able to fight a war. The British armed forces, led by donkeys, who are never done threatening other people's countries, don't have enough munitions to survive a single day, said the recently retired head of the British military. We would run out in hours, he said. Mind you, we've got the Challenger tank, which we've sent to Ukraine, but hold on, Ukraine in the last hour has just denounced the British restrictions on the use of those Challenger tanks, not to send them to risky areas. Hello? Risky areas in a war with a nuclear superpower called Russia. You only want your Challenger tanks to go to areas that are not risky. Where are those? Where are the non-risky areas, little Ben Wallace, that you are prepared to allow the Ukrainians to use your Challenger tank? Speaking of little Ben, you'll remember I have history with him. I did myself up in a dicky bow. I endured the suet pudding of a dinner at the Oxford Union. My good wife in a ball gown, everyone looking their best, all to get my hands on, metaphorically speaking, little Ben Wallace, who didn't show up for the debate. He had a shiver run up his spine somewhere in Whitehall and failed to make the train. But the man he sent in his stead, the well-named Toby Elwood, he tried to make the best fist he could of his warmongering performances in and outside of the House of Commons. He demurred when I accused him of having called for Britain to implement martial law, even though I had seen him on Sky News, his lips moving, actually say it. Because, of course, under martial law, we wouldn't be having a debate, and I wouldn't be broadcasting to you this evening. All civil and democratic rights would be in the bin if we had Toby Elwood in charge of our defences. But Ben is a bitter man. Bitter because he had set his cocked hat at the NATO top job when the Norwegian tailor's dummy, I never remember, is he a tailor's dummy or a hairdresser? Either way, if the hat fits, wear it. Jens Stoltenberg is due to retire. Little Ben threw his cocked hat in the ring, but Joe Biden put the black spot on little Ben. After all that bowing and scraping, after all that kowtowing, after all that kissing, risky, of the US presidential ring, Joe Biden vetoed Ben Wallace as head of NATO. Adding insult to injury, his pick is Ursula von der Leyen. Because of her vast military experience, of course. Because she knows a thing or two about war. Because her sons are fighting at the front, maybe. Oh no, when asked if her own children were in the military, she said, and I quote, ha, ha, ha. No, it's other mothers' sons that they intend to send into the front line. If we get there, I say front line. There will be no meaningful front line, of course, if the nuclear missiles start flying. As I predict, ineluctably, they would and would have to. So we continue to stand on the precipice of the most perilous of time, but we've got Ursula von der Leyen as Commander-in-Chief to rely on. Or Joe Biden, seen on a beach today, a fine figure of a man for 99, literally shuffling around in the sand like a lost and demented senior, with no one apparently even looking after him. But he made the plane and he is on his way now to Europe to justify a decision on cluster bombs which will force most of the NATO countries to break their own law, their own treaty that they signed with such fanfare, not to have anything further to do with these horrific munitions. You saw the picture I put up on the screen there. A picture of a big bomb with hundreds of little bombs, at least 12% of which in Kosovo failed to explode. That is until a child picks them up, years, even decades after the war has gone. Now, I haven't seen these munitions in Kosovo, though I know that 25 years after that war, only a tiny percentage of the huge numbers of cluster bombs that were dropped on Serbia to force it into submission, a submission which has never come and will never come, and Kosovo will never be recognized, neither by Serbia nor by her friends, or even by the many European countries with plenty to lose from the right of regions unilaterally to secede from their territory. But I have been in Cambodia. As a matter of fact, I spent 3 whole weeks in Cambodia as the head of the British contingent of the election monitoring group, monitoring the prime ministerial, general, presidential elections, all in one, in the 1990s. I have fond memories of Cambodia, but not so much of the number of limbless and deformed children that I came across as a result of the carpet bombing with these cluster bombs in the war 50 years and more ago. I mean, like on every street. I mean, like on every corner. I mean, a child unable to hold its begging bowl out on every corner in Cambodia as a result of this bombardment. And Laos was even more severely affected by the use of this munition. I dwell on it not just because of my personal experience, although that is profound in my case. I dwell on it not even to show the hypocrisy of Joe Biden. I dwell on it to show the level of servility of the European allies of Joe Biden in NATO. You see, if somebody was forcing you to humiliate yourself in front of your own public, to whom you had campaigned for a ban on cluster munitions, and someone came along and said, that alliance we're in is going to supply them to the regime in Kiev, you'd think that someone, somewhere, particularly in Britain, where the people's princess, Diana, led the campaign to outlaw these weapons, you'd think that somebody would muster the courage to say, not in my name. All they needed to say was, I'm in for the war in Ukraine. Matter of fact, I'm even more gung-ho than you, President Biden, though I don't have the wherewithal to actually do anything about it. But up with this, I cannot put, because it makes me look like a moral dwarf in front of my public, in front of my monarch. Charles, it was his wife, as was, who led the campaign. But no, all that Rishi Sunak would say is that Britain discourages the use of cluster bombs in Ukraine. The Italian government's been more forthright. The French government has thus far been silent. Maybe because the French government is sailing into all kinds of trouble with NATO, which may or may not be related to recent events. But the French have told NATO that they will not support the opening of a NATO office in Japan on the basis that the North Atlantic Treaty Organization cannot conceivably be defined as having an institutional interest in Tokyo. And they add for good measure, the Japanese are not that mad keen about Joe Biden doing so in any case. France is drawing a line in Asia. Maybe the others in NATO will take heed. Because I warn them this: losing a war against Russia in Ukraine is one thing. You losing a war against China in the Straits of Taiwan, in the South China Sea, will sink your empire forever. Get off the warpath, ladies and gentlemen. You really are not fit for it. Fasten your seatbelts. It's the mother of all talk shows.